So, how did you get into data science?
So I kind of stumbled into it. So I'd studied math and econ and started a PhD program and pretty quickly realized that PhD was not for me. And so left with my master's and then I got a job at a startup. And I think I had originally got an internship for product management. And we very quickly discovered that I wasn't very good at product management. And so after about 2 or 3 months, it was sort of time to figure something out. And as luck would have it, this company needed someone to go into analytics or data science. And with a math and econ background, I was pretty well suited for that. And then I very much needed a job. And so that's how I sort of got into it.
Jay, welcome to my podcast. Super excited to have you. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, hey everyone, my name is Jay Bansal. I'm currently a manager of data science at CVS Health. I've been working in data science for about 10 years in a few different industries and really excited to be on today.
So, how did you get into data science?
So, I kind of stumbled into it. So, I'd studied math and econ and started a PhD program and pretty quickly realized that PhD was not for me. And so left with my master's and then I got a job at a startup. And I think I had originally got an internship for product management. And we very quickly discovered that I wasn't very good at product management. And so after about 2 or 3 months, it was sort of time to figure something out. And as luck would have it, this company needed someone to go into analytics or data science. And with a math and econ background, I was pretty well suited for that. And then I very much needed a job. And so that's how I sort of got into it. And then over the next few years at that job, I had a lot of latitude to sort of learn the ropes of data science and found that it was pretty fun actually in the private sector and haven't really looked back since.
Do you remember what it was about product management that wasn't a good fit for you?
I think one of the biggest things, I was just so new to working. It was my first job. And so I think if I took a crack at product management today, I would at least be slightly better at it. But I think especially in the startup environment, this company was 20, 25 people. I just didn't know enough about what I was doing to do product really well.
Right. It's interesting. I've never thought about it because obviously when you start as a data scientist, right, like you get a project that's well defined and it's kind of very clear how you start. Now, I'm not a product manager, so I don't claim any expertise in the area, right? But to your point, to be a good product manager, you need to understand the business and how to connect the product with the business and the resources and everything. And it seems very hard to do if you're fresh out of school.
That is certainly what I found. I think the business side, especially, is something that you don't really learn formally in any sort of educational setting. And so that part was really difficult to pick up.
Right. I now want to get a product manager on my podcast to ask about this. If anyone's out there listening, please contact me.
We can talk offline, Ida. I can actually recommend one or two people from our sort of extended USC network.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That sounds great. Okay, so you got into data science, and then how did your career evolve?
So I worked at this startup for a few years, and I was the first analytics hire here. So there was definitely a bit of FOMO, I think, at some point when I thought I had learned a decent bit about data science, but I hadn't really worked with many or any other data scientists. And so I was wondering, do I really know my stuff? But after a few years, it was kind of time to move on from that company. And I joined Red Bull. And so this is my first experience on an actual data science team with other data scientists, and then obviously a much bigger company. Red Bull was really interesting. I found it fun to work at a company that sells a physical thing that you can hold in your hand. I thought that was interesting after working at a small tech company. So after Red Bull, I actually very briefly worked in consulting. So in late 2019, I was really obsessed with working remotely. And so this was like a few months before the pandemic, right? So I was like slightly ahead of the curve on that. And so I joined this little consulting company, literally 3 or 4 people in November 2019. And then obviously a few months after that, the pandemic hit the US in full force. And that was not a great time for a small new consulting company to be looking for business. And so a few months after that, I'm like, all right, I should probably look for a new job. And that's how I ended up where I am now at CVS Health. CVS, I am coming up on 3.5 years, actually. So I think very soon it's going to be the longest stint I've ever done at a single company. It's been really good, honestly. I think the big thing with CVS, obviously working in healthcare, has been really interesting. It's a massive industry in the US and very, very complex. And then the other big thing at CVS for the past year and a half, I've had my first chance to manage a team. So I'm managing two people right now. So that's been really interesting as well. Up until this point, I've been pretty much strictly technical individual contributor. So the management side of things has been a learning experience all of its own.
So I definitely want to go into that. Let me backtrack first. Do you work remotely now?
Mostly, I am about, I don't know, 70% remote.
70%. And so because you said you were very obsessed with remote work before the pandemic, and I can relate because I've always liked remote work. I've always mostly worked remotely. But now that you have experience with both, what's your take on the remote versus non-remote? And I obviously understand it boils down to preferences to a large extent too.
Sure, definitely. I think hybrid is the way. Having worked completely remotely for a bit, I just get a little bored in my house. And it is all those things that people say about the water cooler talk and ideas in person. Some of it I think is true. I don't think all of the arguments that these RTO mandates are making are true, but I think some of them, they are true to an extent. But I always found working in person pre-pandemic 5 days a week, I just found that exhausting. And there were definitely plenty of days when it's 3 or 4 o'clock. There's still time left in the workday, but my brain is just completely dead. And so I'm not really doing much until I can have an excuse to go home. So I find that that balance is really nice, having probably at least 50% or more of the time at home to work as productively as I can. And then the rest of the time in the office to do some of the more in person and meeting things.
So do you go to the office when you feel like it, or do you guys have any mandated cadences?
We are we are going in. We are supposed to be going in 3 days every other week. That's our current cadence, and so I think that's nice as well. Actually, having organized days. Otherwise, if people just come in whenever they want, I think you miss a lot of the point because you might come in at a time when no one else is in.
I think about that because it's such an interesting question, right? Because the moment you require people to be in the office a certain amount of time, that implies that they have to live close enough to the office.
Right.
And I'm not saying that that's good or bad, right? I do think it boils down to preferences and the type of work you do. But another option, which is what Zillow did, for example, when I was there, was to have offsites every so often. So you still get to meet the people, but you can live wherever you want, basically.
I think that's a really nice option as well. Because, yeah, during the pandemic, we hired completely remotely. And so now it's kind of a funny thing. These return to office mandates only apply if you live close enough to an office. And if you don't, you can just work from home as much, well, all the time.
Do you think I've heard the argument made that for younger or more junior employees, being completely remote is detrimental to their career progress? Do you agree with that?
I can see that. And I have actually heard some of the younger employees at our company say that they would prefer to work more in office. And I guess thinking back to when I started working, there's a lot of norms, just kind of professional world norms or corporate world norms that I think it would be hard to pick up if you're spending a lot of time at home. So I think I generally agree with that. How have you found it?
It's been always been easy for me to reach out to people, even in a remote setting. So I would proactively reach out to people and ask them for a virtual coffee. I think in general, and I think this applies everywhere, if you don't speak up, no one's going to know what you have to say, right? Because people don't read minds. And so I think you have to be proactive. And I think maybe for many people, it's easier to do it in an in person setting.
Definitely, definitely. I do like in a remote setting, there's more of the only thing you have to show to some extent is deliverables, which I think is nice. Because in the office, obviously some people are more outgoing and they're better at kind of making it look like they do work. Whereas I think remotely, there's less of a way to hide if you're not actually doing anything.
I think that brings up a second interesting point. I think a lot rests on the manager because if you have a competent manager, they're going to be able to define deliverables and what constitutes a deliverable, right? And then you shouldn't have to meet in person to be able to measure that.
Right, right.
But then maybe if it's like a fluffy thing where no one exactly knows what you're working on and you just kind of hang around there in the office and it looks like you work, right? Then maybe that's a problem in itself of like what is work actually.
Yeah, definitely. No, I definitely agree.
And so you switched from the individual contributor track to a manager track. Was it recent?
Yeah, so it's been about a year and a half. I'm still probably my team's small. It's only two people, so I'm still probably roughly 50% hands-on IC, and I like that split. It's been interesting to start just getting into management.
So what are some of the things that you work on?
Sure. So maybe like the gist of our department.
Yeah, like, projects, do predictive models, just a little bit of examples of what it is you and your team work on.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So work for CVS Health. CVS acquired Aetna, the health insurance company, a few years ago. And so what our team does, we work on the Aetna side of the house and we run, can sort of think of them as member marketing campaigns. But instead of a typical marketing campaign where we're trying to sell something, our goals are threefold. We're trying to help our members improve their health. We're trying to help them save money on their medical expenses out of their pocket. And then from Aetna's point of view, the reason we do this stuff, we are trying to reduce Aetna's medical claim spending. And so this specific example that I run, we run a campaign called the Readmissions Avoidance Program. So for our members that go to the hospital, they're admitted to the hospital. When they get discharged, we run this campaign. And basically, as you can probably guess from the name, the point is to prevent them from getting readmitted to the hospital. And we run this as an RCT. So the evaluation, at least high level, is fairly straightforward. But the kicker is that hospital stays and a lot of healthcare in the US is so expensive, you don't have to prevent very many before you're talking about serious cost savings for the company. And then obviously people don't want to go to the hospital either.
Right. And so RCT is randomized control trial for those who don't know.
Yes, exactly.
So what do you randomize? I'm very curious what then treatment is here.
Oh, so I mean, we have a holdout group that doesn't get our messaging, and then we also have basically different channels. We could send a text message or an email, and there's a lot of work around what's the best channel strategy. So we can test channels, and we can also test different types of creative things as simple as subject lines or what's in the content itself.
The hypothesis is that the messaging contains information that helps people avoid a readmission.
Yes, exactly. There's definitely sort of a latent variable there about people are probably more likely to engage with our content if they are more on top of their health in the first place. And so teasing out that causality is very, very difficult. But for our purposes, sort of high level from Aetna's point of view, if the test group has less readmissions or a lower readmission rate, that's kind of the primary thing that we're looking for. The causality is something we're interested in, but is not kind of mission critical to keep running the work.
Could you give an example of what information do you give patients?
A lot of it is fairly straightforward. I would say, like, given that they were just admitted to the hospital, we recommend that they follow up with their PCP or their doctor. Recommend that they stay on top of their medications, any prescriptions that they might have, and then also looking out for common warning signs. If their pain is increasing, not decreasing, for example, that might be an indication that the recovery is not going how they'd want it to.
That is fascinating that just telling people do what the doctor told you would have an effect, right? I guess it kind of makes sense. But
One of the most interesting things is that, yeah, the messaging is not incredibly complex. It's kind of, maybe you could call it reinforcing the basics and just trying to get people to actually do it.
and so who's on your team? Do you guys have like behavioral economists who design these messages, or it's just comes from somewhere else?
We have overall a big cross-functional team. So I'm on the data science side of it. We have a whole marketing operation that actually design the creative. If we actually send a lot of direct mail, like physical in your mailbox mail. So they design things like that and the emails. And then in terms of the messaging itself, Aetna has clinicians, so basically doctors, and we defer to them almost 100% on what the messaging should be. Is it safe? Is it appropriate? Does it make sense for the use case? Things like that.
And so who's on your team besides you?
I have two data scientists on my team, and then cross functionally, we have a couple marketing people. We have one clinician attached to the campaign. And then to get these things out the door, we have a host of, not directly on our team, but we work with a lot of legal, privacy, compliance stakeholders as well, just to make sure we're kind of following all of the rules and regulations.
So, having been in data science for 10 years, you've obviously interviewed a lot of people. And based on your experience, what are the things that you see in interviews that repeat themselves that are good things that people do and then the things that people often get wrong when they interview for a position?
Couple things that come to mind. I would call these sort of the basics, but I think an immediate red flag can be a pretty standard question at some point. Someone's going to ask you, like, tell me about yourself, tell me your background, give me the elevator pitch, however they phrase it. Some people just go on. They'll talk for like 5 or 10 minutes on their elevator pitch. And sometimes I feel a little bad, like cutting them off, but I don't want to eat all the time on that. But that to me is like an initial flag that maybe this person hasn't interviewed a lot, or they don't feel super comfortable with their story, or whatever it might be. That's an immediate one. I think a green flag that I see, sometimes it's very clear that a candidate is kind of taking notes on the interview. I think they definitely should. I've had interviews in the past where I've done really, really badly. I always, take notes on the interview. I won't bomb those questions again. And then something I find kind of rare, but I don't think that it should be, at the end, I always give like 5 minutes to ask for questions from them. I'm looking for fairly thoughtful questions, maybe things around team culture or opportunities, or I don't know, just something thoughtful. And I don't always see that. Sometimes the questions might be things that you could probably get off the JD. And so I think that that's a big green flag. If someone has thoughtful questions, that makes me feel like they're more engaged with the role.
One thing that came up recently when I was speaking with someone was, is it okay to ask about work-life balance, or is that a red flag?
I don't mind asking about work-life balance at all. I think that's perfectly okay. I do think at a big company, it can vary so much. A lot of my interviews are typically general. They might not be for my specific team or even my larger team. And so I can only comment within my universe of CVS Health. I guess the other thing I'd say, if a company has terrible work-life balance, how upfront would your interviewer be about it? I don't know. I feel like some interviewers might minimize.
And I think that's also an art of how to ask questions to get a good answer, right? Instead of asking your future manager of, do you support employee growth? Like, of course, they're going to say yes. But say, like, give me an example of when a direct report of yours learned a new skill because you gave them a project that was challenging or something like that.
Yeah, makes sense. That absolutely makes sense.
And so, what kind of interview questions do you typically see in interviews? And I guess putting that in the larger context of what does an interview loop look like, right? Is there a technical screen and then a virtual on-site with several parts, or what's the whole structure? And then going into the actual sciencey parts, what kind of questions do you see?
Yeah, sure. So we typically have exactly what you said. We might have some sort of recruiter screen, then we have a tech screen, and then we have a multi-part on-site or virtual on-site these days. The tech screen, I think, is a little more textbook, probably some combination of SQL and or Python questions, maybe some machine learning, maybe some experiment design, depending on the role, depending on how long the interview is. And that's when we'll use one of these live coding platforms, CoderPad or what have you. The on-site, I think, is a little bit more varied. Some of them are more technical, but kind of more technical case studies. So I'll have a couple case studies I run through, maybe one on experiment design, maybe one on machine learning. Recently, I've been experimenting with actually just sticking to a candidate's resume and deep diving on one or two of their projects and then just pushing on various aspects. I think that's been interesting as well. I found that interesting getting to hear someone describe their own work brings something different to the table as opposed to if I'm just asking kind of my own design case study.
What are the tips to think about when you're asked about your own work?
When you're asked about your own work, I think just making sure to start from the business case and making sure you're telling that logical story, because it's very easy when you're talking about your own work, especially as a technical person, to immediately dive into the details. But yeah, really starting with that context when you're effectively talking to a stranger and describing it and really telling that story from start to finish.
And I think that's something that the more advanced of a technical degree you have, the higher the risk of going straight into, oh, I proved a central limit theorem of some sort. Like, but why would I care about that?
Definitely. I'm curious, Ida. So we also have, in addition, on the final loop, in addition to technical case study interviews, we also have some culture fit. interviews. I'm assuming you've done those as well. Do you have like what are your thoughts on those? And I can give my thoughts as well.
That's a super interesting topic. So they typically are questions of the sort of tell me about the time when you had a conflict on the team and how you resolved it, or a time when you learned a new skill unrelated to your work. And so I find that those questions, obviously, those are important aspects of a person to learn about, right? Because I think broadly you want to speak with someone who you want to work with someone who is able to articulate criticism and listen to criticism and not take things personally if there is a conflict situation, and also proactively learn new skills. I'm not 100% sure how good those questions are at eliciting that, right? Because what I find is that you could have going in like maybe 4 or 5 situations from your life that you could adapt to basically any of those questions. And then I guess the question is, are the examples you have kind of thorough enough to really be a strong signal, right? I don't know. I'm a little bit torn on this. Like, I do think those are important questions to ask, but I don't think you always get an answer that really allows you to have a strong signal about the thing you're asking about.
I think I generally agree. I found with usually I'm on technical interviews, and so I have less experience with culture fit ones. But when I'm doing them at the end, when I'm writing my review, I'm not sure how much of it, exactly what you're saying, I'm not sure how much of it I got from the question, the answer to the question, versus my general perception of the candidate, their overall communication skills, and even essentially sometimes it feels like a vibe check.
Yeah. And I think one way to get information about a person is when you ask them a technical question that they don't know the answer to. How do they react? Because that's like a real life test of their way to deal with something that's a problem, right? Are they going to try to make something up and just kind of bullshit their way out of it? Or are they going to say, well, I actually don't know about this topic, but this is how I would go about getting the information?
Yeah, makes sense.
So going back to the IC versus manager track, you said the experience of managing has been interesting. So are there any highlights or lowlights of that experience?
Highlights and lowlights. I think a highlight and a challenge, it's just completely different. If you come from IC, from technical IC work, this might be obvious. Management is a completely different skill set. And with technical IC work, you've probably studied something in the ballpark, if not exactly what you're doing. But with management, you probably haven't. And I think something almost universally interesting about technical management is the skills that get you to manager are typically not the skills that helped you earlier in your career. If you're a great technical IC, that might help get you promoted to being a manager, but to be a good manager, it's a completely different skill set.
What are the skills you think are important in a good manager?
I think one of the ones we touched on before, having clear deliverables is really helpful. Obviously, just so your team knows what is expected of them, understanding where your team wants to go and helping them get there. And I mean, day to day, that can be as simple as making sure their assignments are giving them skills in areas that they want to grow. Those are probably the top two that come to mind. Just having that plan for the future. I think that second one is really important.
And so do you see yourself going, I guess, more and more down the manager route?
I think so. Yeah, so far, I'd like to do that. I would like to stay hands on, but there's an inherent tension there. I think as you keep moving in management, it's harder and harder to do any IC work.
I agree. And I think that's something I hear from people again. I also think there's a kind of credibility aspect, right? Because if you're, so I guess there are people who are managers and have been hands on and now they're not just because of lack of time. But then there's people who are managers who have never been hands on. So they don't know exactly what they are managing. And so I find that second situation to sometimes be problematic.
Yeah, I generally agree. And I see that a lot in analytics. It's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I'm obviously most familiar with data science, but I don't think you would have a team of software engineers with a manager that doesn't know software engineering, or a team of car mechanics and the manager doesn't know anything about cars. But in analytics, maybe because it's relatively new or it's buzzwordy, that definitely seems more okay, more acceptable.
So, what is analytics? How would you describe it, and how is it different from data science?
Today, I guess based on sort of a combination of my personal opinion and what I think I see in the industry, analytics seems to be more of the the descriptive side of things. What happened? How much of this did we sell? Or how did this cost distribution look? Or maybe even getting into some experiment design evaluation. Data science seems to be more to me of an umbrella term, probably getting including analytics, but then also getting more into machine learning. It seems now some of the more ML ops, MLE, that's kind of this semi new track that we're seeing. And that's more of the data scientists spend a lot of time building things, maybe in Jupyter notebooks. How do we get some of this stuff into production? It's not exactly software engineering. And so maybe we can lump it in under MLE or ML ops.
I guess thinking about from the, well, maybe you can't. I was going to order them by less statistically rigorous to more statistically rigorous, but I see now maybe that's not a good ordering. But first, we have analytics, which is basically querying data to get descriptive statistics and then put them in dashboards. And then we have data science, which is, I think we all know what data science is. And then MLOps, which is productionizing the data science models, basically.
I think where it gets tricky is the titles don't strictly correspond. Like any given company could mean something different with their specific title.
And so, in your world of data science, how much of it is kind of predictive modeling and having random forest regressors to predict something versus more kind of causal, more economic or econometric type of data science?
I would say our team's work overall is probably more of the latter. We do a lot of experiment design, evaluating the experiment design. And then I think there's a ton of descriptive analytics that goes into thinking about what we could try next. And it's only a subset of our work that really has a lot of machine learning involved.
And so, one question I get a lot, and I don't really have a good answer to it, is how do you get into those types of roles that are more causal and economic without having a PhD in economics? Because I'm only familiar with this very kind of straightforward track of you finish your PhD and then you have these companies like Amazon that basically have a funnel specifically for PhD economists into those types of roles. But I also know there's a lot of people out there who have an undergrad or a master's degree in economics who are perfectly capable of doing that sort of stuff. But where do you look for those types of jobs?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think I have a great answer either. I will say, at least within CVS, after you have built your credibility at a company, I think it's much easier to either officially move into a new role, a new team, or even talk to your manager and say, hey, I'm interested in this type of work. Can we start getting X% of my portfolio on that? And if you are, I think, intentional about that and keep pushing in that direction, it takes time, but eventually you will be able to maybe make that jump.
And so, as suppose someone is working as a data scientist and has maybe a couple of years of experience and they're thinking about what should I be doing to further my career and have the best opportunities in the future? Should they be reading scientific papers? Should they be, coding on Kaggle to submit stuff to competitions, or should they be working on presentation skills? Like, what do you recommend to someone who's more junior?
Which is a very difficult question, Ida. Before I take a shot at it, I will say I think data science is one of these unique fields where it moves so quickly that there's a decent amount of effort just trying to keep up with what's going on. But I think for your question specifically, I would advise that person to try and think about what direction they want to go within data science. The last one you mentioned, presentation skills. So maybe they're interested in a more kind of descriptive role. Maybe they're even, I think I've seen data science product manager roles. So maybe they're interested in that, or maybe they want to specialize in experiment design, or maybe they want to get more on the MLE side of things or the machine learning side of things. So I think I'd advise them to think very carefully about where they want to go and then use that to inspire. So if it's more of a data science product management track, then they probably want to pick up some PM skills because they probably don't have them. If it's a more technical MLE sort of stack, then maybe cloud engineering, software engineering skills and disciplines that they probably haven't had exposure to on that side.
Another question I often get is, should I be learning Python or R?
For me today, I think it's Python. Even our studio rebranded Deposit. It feels to me like R is not a production software.
I agree, but I like to ask other people to make sure I'm not giving a very biased answer. And so you mentioned that data science is changing really quickly. Are there any recent or new things that you think are worth pointing out?
At the risk of just over repeating, I think kind of ChatGPT and generative AI, this has been a huge focus at CVS recently as well. I think that's brought a lot of interest to the field. And then also, I think, has kind of raised questions around, is AI part of data science? Like, how do we define data science, which can sometimes be a very vague term. But yeah, that would probably be the kind of thing in the last 6 to 12 months that I'd mention.
So do you guys use generative AI as part of your coding process, or do you use it anywhere in any production frameworks?
So none of my teams specifically are using generative AI. We have a bunch of use cases, which I'm very, very interested to see where they go and kind of how they end up. And we have an internal version of ChatGPT. I played around with it. Day to day, I find it, if I'm writing something, I find it difficult to use ChatGPT, either public or private, because I want to try and understand what I'm writing.
You mean writing text or writing code?
Sorry, writing code, I should say.
Writing code, okay, yeah. I do like it for writing code, adding doc strings and stuff like that. I find it, I don't know, maybe I'm not using it correctly, but I find it surprisingly bad at for example, summarizing text. I played around quite a bit and I haven't been able to get decent enough summaries of text where it has all the right details that I would like it to keep, but just a bit more succinct.
Interesting, interesting. Someone I work with actually, they recently told me, I won't name names obviously. So we're going through an end of year review process as we do every year. And part of that is giving feedback on people that you worked with. And they mentioned that for people they weren't super familiar with, they asked ChatGPT to write a generic description of, let's say, a senior data scientist with above average performance. And then they used that as inspiration and like pointers to write their actual review. Thought that was kind of interesting. And that was not definitely not something I'd thought about before.
Right. Well, I could see how why that would work, right? Because I don't know, I find like it gives these very kind of boilerplate generic statements, and it is good at generating ideas. I find like give it a blog post and say, give me 5 ideas for a title that's like good for SEO and whatnot. And I don't know. I mean, I use it a little bit like that, but I always end up rewording because I find that either I write something that is my own style and then I have to write it myself. Like I can't really outsource that to ChatGPT.
Right. Yeah, totally agreed.
What do you see as like next steps for your career? Are the logical steps kind of managing a bigger and bigger team, or later some kind of, I know, VP type positions where you lead more of a you know product group, or where do you see yourself in some years?
I think right now, probably, yeah, that management track of leading a bigger team, something I've also been getting into. We're in the midst of a cloud migration. And so this has been it's been a lot of fun just to learn more about cloud, we're moving to Google Cloud specifically. And so I've been getting more into sort of the MLE side of things, and I'm interested in learning more about that.
Right. I'm a huge fan of Google Cloud. I wish more companies were on it.
Yeah, it's been really fun to learn about.
And I guess one more thing I wanted to ask about is, do you have thoughts on centralized data science teams versus embedded and kind of product related units, and how to think about that if you're interviewing for a position? Which one might be a better fit for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. So being within CVS, our overall analytics org, I can't even keep track. I think it has between 2,000 and 3,000 people at this point. It's not just data scientists, it's data engineers and PMs and a lot of related roles. But when someone interviews, it's sometimes hard to communicate the scale of the org and understand even where any one given team sits, whether it's embedded, whether it's centralized. I think understanding that externally is very, very difficult as a candidate. My personal thoughts on it, I think the centralized aspect is really important, because one of the most fun things of working on a big data science team is that there's an expert on everything. Whatever I need help on, it's possible to find within the org someone that's probably pretty good at it. And I think that benefit kind of comes from a centralized team. I think the embedded aspect is also really important from the perspective of building trust with the business. It probably depends on the industry that you're working at, but Aetna and CVS have been around for a long time before they had data science teams. And so it's critical for the business to trust us enough to actually use our work. And that's where I think that embedded side of it really comes in.
And I think another thing to think about if you're more junior is there someone who's more senior who's going to advocate for you? Because if you go to a team that maybe is embedded in a product and maybe you're the only data scientist, sometimes it can be hard to get your ideas heard if you're the only one who understands what you're doing, right? And also sometimes you might not know what you should be doing, right? If you're junior, and it would be nice to have someone more senior to mentor you.
That's definitely true. If you're the junior person on an embedded team, I think it can be limiting in sometimes because your product team might have certain ideas of what data science is for that don't necessarily align with yours.
So the last few months or maybe even a year have been interesting, I think, from a job market perspective, right? Like we shifted from this crazy hiring and I guess people switching jobs during the pandemic to a market that right now is kind of weird and you have all these layoffs. Like from where you sit, do you have any sense of, you know, what the market feels like? And I understand, like, I understand you don't know, right, if there's going to be a recession or not. That's not what I'm asking, but just from where you are and the people you know, what's your sense of where we are right now?
Yeah, it feels to me like the market is still fairly cold. What's nice, I mean, I feel like I have a couple different pulses on it. I guess everyone can see whatever company they're at. You can see the number of new hires. There's usually some sort of welcome announcement, right? So you can track those. I interview at CVS, so I can kind of judge the volume of how many interview requests I'm getting from our recruiting teams to judge how much CVS is hiring. It does feel like the market is still pretty tough. I think I'm just surprised at how long it's been tough. Every time I hear a big company announcing a wave of layoffs, I think for the past few months, I'm like, all right, surely this will be the last big company announcing big tech layoffs. But no, not really. It just keeps going. I think fairly recently, LinkedIn announced some layoffs. And so I've just been a little surprised at how long it's going on. But yeah, as far as I can tell, it still seems like a pretty tough market. And CVS actually had some layoffs earlier this year.
Almost everyone had some layoffs, it sounds like, when you speak to people. So hopefully you know, it gets better at some point soon.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Ida. So I feel like before this most recent downturn, big tech was arguably a very desirable place to work in data science. And I think the layoffs have maybe taken a little bit of luster off those companies. And maybe even recent things like ChatGPT have taken a little bit of the luster off. How do you feel about that? Do you still think those are some of the most desirable employers in our field?
So I think it's going to be very situation dependent. I think if you do very kind of advanced technical type of work, so suppose you design some, I don't know, staggered experiment rollout, or you do observational causal inference with synthetic controls or something like that. Some of these big tech companies that have very established teams that do this kind of science are for sure a good place to be, because I think you have a much higher chance of working on a project that's intellectually challenging. Of course, you have the risk of layoffs, right? Now, I think you have that risk at any company, right? And at a smaller company, you also have, if you go to a really small startup, right? Many startups fail just percentage wise. And so you, of course, have that risk. I think you could find a very small startup that has extremely intellectually rewarding work, but I think that might just be harder to find, right? Because if you're a, I don't know, statistician or causal economist, you know that those teams exist at Amazon and Netflix and at Spotify and so on. So I don't know. I also feel it boils down a lot to what do you want to do? Do you want to be more entrepreneurial, or do you want to more be part of a kind of established system? Because if you really have this drive to build something of your own, and I think also use other skill sets than just data science, then probably a smaller company is the place to be.
Yeah, that feels right. That feels right. And I think with the most recent AI boom, there's a lot of very interesting small and medium sized companies doing work.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Right. And in the end, it might be something where you have to try both to see what you actually prefer. So I feel like that's a good note to end on, unless there's something I haven't asked you about that you'd like to share.
No, nothing else comes to mind at the moment. Yeah, this was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you a lot for coming. I will maybe put your LinkedIn or so below in the show notes if people want to reach out to you.
That sounds great.
And yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me, Ida.